about contemporary capitalism. So one of the epistemological challenges, if you like, with Marxism is that it tends to close itself off. It tends to become Catholic, tends to become dogmatic in terms of its place in the world as a religion. And so it is sometimes divorced and cut off from reality. And so what we're trying to do is get Marxism to live, to breathe in the conditions of the contemporary world. The second volume is really about capitalism's crises, class struggles in South Africa and the world. And here we're recognizing that the contemporary crises of capitalism are much more complex than monocausal, singular explanations that sometimes Marxism gives us. Overproduction, financial over-accumulation, all of that is correct. And it does help us explain and understand to a degree what's happening today. But there's something more going on in the world today. There's a depth of systemic crises, or to use a Gramscian language, organic crises, that are very deep. And they are unprecedented. So you might have the systemic contradiction of inequality, but you also have the climate crisis, you have resource peak, you have the hollowing out of democracies as market democracies, and something we'll be talking about today. So crises are much more complex today. And in this volume, we grapple with that issue. The third volume is really around the climate crisis, and again, trying to think more deeply about the climate challenge, or what Harvey calls the dangerous contradiction. But when you talk about the climate crisis, you can get very debilitated. You can end up in a kind of fatalistic place. You can end up in a catastrophic place. And so it's important to keep the science in mind, but also to think through the alternatives, the new imaginings, the new emancipatory impulses that are there. We have 20 years to prevent a 2-degree overshoot of planetary temperature, according to Oxford University. So tick-tock, tick-tock, it's ticking. So we profile in this volume some of the best thinking in the climate justice movement in the world and in the South African context. This next volume, Racism After Apartheid, will be out in March next year. And really it's kind of revisiting this whole challenge of how we understand contemporary racism, both in the world and at a global scale. We are seeing the re-racializing alongside the de-racializing of dynamics in our society. But we are also seeing the rise of neo-fascism in the world. Deeply ethno-nationalist, deeply xenophobic, deeply white supremacist in some places. And so we got to really put some of these things into perspective, and this volume tries to do some of that. So in short, the Democratic Marxism series has really been about a living Marxism. It's been about conjunctural analysis. It's been about trying to think through the contemporary alternatives that are there on the ground, and it's trying to connect with the living impulse of left praxis. The sixth volume in the series is called New Imperialism, and that will come out later next year, which I'm busy editing. So, the rise and fall of Marxist theories of the state. So, Marx did not leave us a developed theory of the state. There are different conceptions, there are throwaway statements and remarks, if you like. There are some political writings that deal with particular historical moments that bring out particular conceptions of the state. But a more systematic reading of Marx has given us an instrumentalist conception of the state. So the state is the executive committee of the bourgeoisie. And sometimes this has gotten universalized. This is the only understanding of the state. And the logical conclusion from that is that we must smash the state. So it served as the premise for revolutionary political strategy. Then you had the Bonaparte State. And the Bonaparte State idea comes out of Marx reflecting on the failures of the 1848 revolution and the kind of Bonaparte's legacy that is part of reaction. It's military officers and so on. And around 1852 he's reflecting on this and how counter-revolution comes to the fore, and this idea of the strong man leading society and so on, which was very much part of the Bonapartist ideology. And then the Paris Commune. in 1871, where Marx is looking at this development, which didn't last very long, and he sees it as a precursor, a precedent, if you like, for the making of a worker-led state. Deeply democratic, very much about participation and constituting workers' power from below. So the Marx's legacy on the state has been engaged with, has been fed off, if you like, and appropriated in different ways. So Marxist-Leninists have, if you like, staked out the instrumentalist understanding of the state in Marx, and that has become a dogmatic conception of how to understand the state and state power. In the 60s and 70s, you've seen a flourishing of new thinking within Marxism about the contemporary state. In that context, thinking about the welfare state in Western Europe, and thinking about its forms, its functions, but also thinking about the institutions that make up the state. And so there's the big Miliband Polantzis debate, with Polantzis also talking about the ideological state apparatus and so on. This then gets, of course, eclipsed in the 80s by historical sociologists, some of them Marxist inspired, who talk about the developmental state. There's a rise of a discursive approach to the state. So what are the ideological practices of the state? And this relates to Foucault. And then, of course, there are feminist conceptions of the state. So how does the state, in its interventions, in its projects, shape gender relations and so on, and reproduction? But this, all of this gets eclipsed by the rise of globalization, the globalized state, and so on. And that has left us, for the past 3 decades, if you like, in a zombie state. How do you think about the state? Or what has happened to the state? There's one state. And so, in many ways, there's been a disjuncture in thinking. And so, the globalized state has risen. And in that context, it has thrown up very, very important questions. You know, what has happened to the state as a concept? What has happened to the state as a relation? And what has happened to the state as a reality? So the globalized state disrupts us and forces us to think, well, what is the state? Okay? And in that context, there's a nomenclature, there are a whole host of categories, there are a whole host of conceptions that have emerged to understand the globalized state. Some refer to it as the market state, some refer to it as a competition state, some refer to it as a good governed state, and so on. But the question we have to ask is, does historical Marxist perspectives and do contemporary Marxist approaches help us understand the state? Does it have something to offer? And that's the crux of today's theory seminar. So, the post-apartheid state is also something that's going to feature in our conversation. And David, it's good to see you here. We have comrades like David Masondo, and at this point I'll table Comrade Dinga Sikwe, whose apology is actually very sick at the moment. He was about to board his plane, but he just couldn't manage, Jane, so we have to talk about that. So he sends his sincere apologies. He really wanted to be here. So in terms of thinking about the post-apartheid state, so what is it? There's definitely continuities and discontinuities with the apartheid state, despite us having, if you like, a new constitutional template, despite us having, if you like, deregulated apartheid laws and so on. But it's something to think about. The conceptual semantics of the state has also changed. So we refer to the post-apartheid state as a liberal state. We refer to it as a developmental state. And yesterday, I don't know if you're listening to the radio, but Blaine Nzimande was screaming at Jacob Zuma for misleading young people. And he said that Jacob Zuma was talking about the liberal state. Okay, the 3 arms of government have not been captured, therefore there's no state capture. Okay? So, Nzimande in our public discourse was saying to Zuma, well, you're a liberal. And as Marxists, there are many institutions that make up the state. in South Africa. And some of those institutions have been captured. Okay? So there's the idea of the shadow state that has also entered our discourse. And again, we want to subject all these conceptions to scrutiny in our seminar today. There's also been the conjunctural remaking of the state over 24 years. It has taken on board new forms, new functions, and new spatiality. Okay, so you have over 270 local governments. You have the state locked into regional arrangements, into global treaties, etc., etc. It plays a role in managing a deep process of globalization. So has the state inadvertently undermined, actually, the South African Constitution? It's a very interesting question. Okay? It's an interesting question. And we're going to interrogate this question. Does the South African state have a strategic project? Would you say that it all adds up? Would you say that we are moving in a particular direction in terms of restructuring accumulation, in terms of state-civil society relations, in terms of international relations, in terms of our ecological relations? Would you say that the state, in terms of a nation-building project, is taking us in a clear, purposive direction? What are the relational class and social forces that constitute the state? So what are the forces that crystallize, that congeal, that stand behind the state? It's a very, very important issue that we want to unpack here. Okay? Is the state a working class-led state? You'll hear that rhetoric in the ANC-led alliance. The National Democratic State is working class-led, you know, it's logic. But is it really working class-led? Okay? Are these abstractions really misleading? Okay? From within and outside South Africa, there are powerful forces shaping the state. The World Trade Organization, we were not consulted on this, but we locked into a relationship with the World Trade Organization that really undermines the power of the state. Okay? It's a very, very serious issue. Okay? The way the surveillance reports of the IMF and World Bank come out and set standards for the performance, for the behavior of the state, we don't get consulted on all of that. Credit rating agencies are more important than your vote. Right? That's a very, very serious issue that relates to democracy and so on. So, finally, and to conclude, to set the scene. So, part of what we're going to be talking about also is the future of the capitalist state. And here there's various themes that we're hoping will feature in our conversation together. The state, in the context of globalization, has also found its place in regional relationships. The big European Union project, kicking off with coal integration in the 50s, European Union monetary integration in the 90s, is now unraveling. Okay? So, is regionalization over? You've had other forms of regionalization, some starting with free trade areas, some with political integration like in our own continent. Is regionalization dead? Okay? Or where does the state fit into regionalization? Are there other possibilities for regionalization? There's the whole question of big data versus the surveillance state. So Foucauldian analyses of the state will talk about how the state is engaging in full spectrum surveillance of all of us. And there's a lot of truth to this. Okay? Snowden has raised the alarm bells of what this means today. The big battle for privacy, the right to protect your information, your digital self, and so on. On the other hand, big data is here to stay, and it is very, very important. And it will play a very crucial role in how states function and how they operate. Yesterday I was in a panel discussion, I was making the point about how weather and big data around weather is going to be very, very important for a climate-driven world. Okay? And big data helping us understand weather patterns efficaciously will help us preempt a lot of impacts that will come in climate change and so on. So tornadoes. You can predict tornadoes, well, you're going to predict tornadoes, but at least you'll have a handle on some of the patterns, and you'll be able to, if you like, to a public service, inform people timelessly. You'll be able to manage droughts much more effectively, disaster management responses and so on. The other idea that I think some of us have been talking about for a long time in our own work is the climate failed state versus the climate emergency state. So, you know, Western political science pathologizes the state, particularly in the global south. It's a failed state, typically by their standards. There's elements of corruption to it, so it's the big man patrimonial state or neo-patrimonial state. Ironically, you have a lot of corruption in the global West as well. Corruption is bad for all politics, for all peoples, for all societies. But the climate failed state is something new. These are states that are incapable of dealing with climate shocks, and they're going to grow. Some people talk about the Syrian conflict as a climate war. It might be hyperbole, but the climate factor was an accelerator, was a threat multiplier, was a causal factor in the unraveling. We are going to see more of this when climate shocks hit, and they're going to come with big fiscal costs. Nobody's counting the cost of our drought. It's not over. Okay? This is going to have serious implication for the fiscal viability of states. At the same time, we need to be thinking about building climate emergency states, states that are able to build systems that can survive, that can help us survive, that can handle shocks, etc. We are seeing border regimes and neo-fascism. Border regimes are becoming more and more controlling. They're becoming much more selective in terms of access. And in the European context, in the context of Trump's America, there's talk of big walls and thousands of soldiers policing borders, etc. And you're seeing a neo-fascism emerge as well. But a neo-fascism that's not abandoning globalization, interestingly enough, but is wanting to build fortress societies, okay? And it is positioning the state to play a role in all of this. Then, of course, there's the whole question of the state and the future of democracy. Right now, the state has endured a squeeze from the market, such that democracies are market democracies. We are now seeing an authoritarian squeeze coming with the rise of neo-fascism. What is the future of democracy and the relationship with the state? This is a very serious question. For those of us on the left, and you'll hear it in the course of today, we need more democracy, not less. We need deep democracy. Okay? And it can't just be the ritualizing of parties and elections. We need to empower citizenship to own democracy, to shape sovereignty, and so on. And then finally, there's a whole question of decolonizing state theory. State theory is a derivative of Western thought, and it's grown up in the Western context. But the idea of the state actually precedes capitalism, and you'll hear more about that today. The state emerges before capitalism. So if you look at China, interestingly enough, for almost 2,000 years, it had a very sophisticated bureaucracy, a hierarchized bureaucracy. Okay? Western thought has thought about and has spoken to us about the Weberian bureaucracy, the rational ordering of state power, and so on. But in the context of the Western state, you had rational ordering of state power in China for over 2,000 years. There's something there. Also in the context of our own African experience, there's been African forms of democracy related to managing the commons, okay? Water, land, forests, etc. And there's something to learn from all of these experiences for state theory. On that note, I'm going to stop there. So this is the kind of framing, this is the context in which we're going to proceed today. And I don't know, are there any comments, questions, expectations before we proceed? Our program is pretty tight. We're going to kick off with the first session on old Marxist theories of the state, what is relevant, and we'll give you some extra time because Dinga is not here, so that's why we're trying to adjust a little bit. And Devin will cover 3 readings. All these readings have been sent out to all of you. Thereafter, we'll have a session on globalization and new Marxist theories of the state. Again, there's 3 readings here. We've sent this out to you. We'll have a tea, coffee break. The 3rd session is the state in South Africa and beyond. What do Marxists have to say? And we have Comrade David Masondo, and he's shared a reading with us. Comrade Dinga, as I said, is very ill. He can't be here. And then Michelle Williams, who's from the sociology department, has also shared 2 readings with us as well. Did all of you get the readings? Did all of you do the readings? Okay.
read the Communist Manifesto.
You know?
I've read that. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Professor. I just want clarity
Sure.
for your views. And you know, we currently have this state capture empire. And media, some media houses, they claim that former President Zuma and the Guptas tried or created something like a shade. I won't name that journalist. Do you agree with that?
Okay, that's a good question. That's a good question. And let's park that question in the conversation. So let's make sure that we all engage with it as the day unfolds. Is that okay? All right. Anybody else? I'm going to wrap up so I can hand over to Deb. Are you excited? We look forward to your contributions. And it's all being recorded because we're going to share this as a resource. We've always done that. Okay, Deb, over to you.
Thanks, Vish. Morning, everyone. Okay, that's a good question. Session 3 is going to focus directly on what's happening in South Africa. We're going to start off, I suppose, we don't have to be formulated about it. Things can flow into each other. But we're going to start off with just some reflections on early Marxist theories and states. In fact, to an extent, this paves the way for the later discussions. So it's more as a backdrop and to revisit what we, as teenagers, read, the Communist Manifesto and other things, and what we believed, Lenin, State and Revolution. We all read those things, and some of us imbibed it as the gospel, others were more critical. In our own experience here, and not just here, but globally, Marxist perspectives have been challenged, not just, but from two directions, you could say. From the liberal pluralist perspective, and from the anarchist perspective. And sometimes the liberal pluralist and anarchist critiques are very similar, but their solutions are very different. So I want to reflect a little bit on that. So we'll start with the Communist Manifesto. Now this, as Vish mentioned, this is the classical perspective that most people who say they are aligned to a Marxist perspective, they take this as their departure point. That in the Communist Manifesto, Marx talks about other preceding modes of production, feudalism, the absolute state, etc., and how the bourgeoisie rose to become the dominant class in the 19th century, starting in England and then spreading to the rest of Western Europe. But this is a very interesting quote. It says the bourgeoisie has at last, since the establishment of modern industry and of the world market, now this was written in 1841, when Marx was still quite young. And I say Marx, because Marx mainly wrote this. It's attributed to Marx and Engels. But in actual fact, there was a third person, and that was Marx's life partner, who also helped write this, Jenny Marx. Unattributed, but she helped to write the Communist Manifesto. And you see this in the movie on Karl Marx, while the three of them sit in midnight oil trying to get this right as a document. Now, this is a very interesting quote, I think, because there's a lot embedded in it. So, and of the world market conquered for itself in the modern representative state, exclusive political sway. So that's a very bold statement. Okay? Exclusive political sway. You might say it's an overstatement. The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. Now it seems like a straightforward one. Okay, the capitalist class, capitalists control the state, and the state is just merely doing the bidding of the capitalists. That's a common sense interpretation. But why do you think does Marx, or the Marx and Engels, talk about the common affairs? Why do they use the word common? Why don't they just say it's but a committee for managing the affairs of the bourgeoisie? Why common affairs? And why whole bourgeoisie? Does anybody want to comment on that? Because this, for me, makes this a very complex statement in the Communist Manifesto. Not an easy, simplistic one. Anyone? Okay.
Yeah, I'm looking at it in the sense that it's actually meaning the affairs of the same bourgeoisies, but in relation to the affairs of common people as well.
Not quite. Okay, so by common affairs, what they are implying is that the bourgeoisie is not one thing. It's a differentiated class. They're class fractions. They are different capitalists who are in competition with each other, but not just as individual capitalists, but as sectors of the capitalist class, or sectors of economy, even. Manufacturing, finance, mining, etc. Right? And they have different fractional class interests. And one of the key functions of the state is to manage those diverse interests of the capitalist class, their common affairs, both amongst themselves, but also in relation to the working class. Right? Because there is that inherently antagonistic relationship between the capitalist class, which is involved, which is central to the accumulation of capital, and the working class. And the accumulation of capital and the capitalist imperative, we can also argue further, is a force that is above the capitalist class. They are themselves victims of it, right? The power of capital. And some Marxist theorists later on insist on a distinction between capital, the power of capital, and the people, the capitalists, who are themselves also part of the treadmill, and can be destroyed in the process of the rise of the boom and bust cycle.
Before you leave this quote, I wanted to just pose two questions about it, or ask two questions about two other words that appear here. The first is representative.
Yes.
So this is written before the extension of the franchise to women and before the extension of the franchise to the working class.
Right.
In Europe.
Right.
I'm not sure what the situation then in the USA is, but at least in Europe, there's no universal franchise. The bourgeoisie, right, and the landlords, effectively property owners, are, or those without property don't have any representation in the state formally, and women don't. So that, why does he then use the word representative state? Is my first question. The second one is, and surely that's that fact that later the franchise was extended. I don't know whether Marx and Engels and the life partner foresaw that, or it was assumed by them and later Lenin that. I mean, how does that change things? Then the second interesting thing there is the word executive. That when Jacob Zuma gave his lecture to SASCO students, he made this point that the modern state is composed of three branches, as Vish was telling us. But here Marx is talking about one element of the state. And it again goes to there's the judiciary, there's a legislature, there's all kinds of parts of the state. But here he's specific about the executive. Is that significant or not?
Okay, let me go through this. I might answer some of this in the course of what I have to say, but we can come back to it. I've noted it. Okay, now I thought I would start with an anarchist critique, and Bakunin and Kropotkin were two critics of Marx, but at the same time they were deep admirers of Marx. Bakunin and Marx were very close at one point, but then they went their own way. And I think that there is something to the critique which resonates with our own democratic, socialist, democratic Marxist thinking today, which is useful to bear in mind. And one does not have to appreciate, or one does not have to embrace anarchism to appreciate the anarchist critique, just as one does not have to embrace liberalism to appreciate liberal critiques as well. That's something I thought I'd have to say. Now, what they said at the time was that Marx and Engels, and some people make a distinction between Marx and Engels and what we know, what we talk about as Marxism, or Marxist-Leninism in the 20th century, is mainly Engelsism, because Engels interpreted Marx in a less dialectical fashion. That's what some people believe. And whereas Marx himself was more nuanced in his thinking. What they did not see, they argue, is that the state is not just simply an executive of the bourgeoisie or just simply acting on the instruction of the bourgeoisie. That the state can be an act in its own right, not just in those moments of Bonapartism, but beyond that. And the confidence that Marx and Engels expressed that the state would wither away. In fact, Engels says very explicitly that the last act of the state would be when it socializes private property and the means of production. And that would be its last act. Well, the anarchists argue, well, that they argued then that's a wishful thinking, because we will actually be putting in place a bureaucratic class that will be running the state. So they wanted to do away with the state altogether. But anarchists also note that Marx and Engels were not consistent in their view. So Marx, in one throwaway statement, talks about the dictatorship of the proletariat. But in other moments, earlier in 1850, but also when writing about the Paris Commune in 1871, came close to arguing for workers' self-government, which is similar to what the anarchists were arguing. So there's a libertarian moment in Marx, sort of a quasi-anarchist moment, if you want. And Marx and Engels' vision of communism is very similar to the anarchist vision of communism, stateless society. The question is how you get there. But there's another moment in Marx later on, which is what some calls the democratic moment. By democratic, Marx as a Democrat, by that is meant a belief in a multi-party parliamentary system, where they explicitly state that, and I've got quotes here if you want to argue with me, I won't quote the quotes, where Engels explicitly states that we don't have to, it all depends, whether they are right, it depends on the state of class struggle at that moment. And when they were writing later on in their life, they were noticing the development of the Social Democratic Party in Germany, the opportunity now of workers to vote, fighting for workers, well, still male workers, but later on the franchise was extended to women as well in the 20th century. And they thought that this was a possible opportunity for workers to advance their class interests through multi-party democracy. So you have both emphases in Marx, which gave rise to different theoretical perspectives in the 20th century, debates amongst Marxists. So as I said, the anarchist critique in many respects resembles the liberal pluralist critique in that they grant the state a high degree of autonomy, right? Whereas Leninists invoke the earlier conception of the state as an instrument of the capitalist class, and the only way to resolve that problem of class domination is to smash the state. So you have this curious, I found a curious coming together of a anarchist critique which is similar to the liberal pluralist, but the anarchist solution is similar to the Leninist, which is smash the state. Right? Of course, the Leninists want to then reconstruct the state as a dictatorship of the proletariat, albeit momentarily in history, but that moment lasted for a long time. Whereas the anarchists want to do away with the state altogether immediately. That's where they're different. So as we know, Marx does talk about the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie when he writes about the Paris Commune, and, but Lenin takes it further. Lenin makes this into a catechism, right? The dictatorship of the proletariat, which of course Stalin then seizes. So the establishment of a workers' government and what actually happened in the Soviet Union, anarchists today still point to that. They say, well, no, I know many Leninists would say Stalin is not our responsibility. Lenin wrote in the dying bed, I don't want Stalin to be the next leader because he was a brute. And Trotsky spoke that with justification. The Communist Party in South Africa, of course, wouldn't hear any of it because they believed in Stalin until Gorbachev came. Okay, no, maybe they shifted with Khrushchev in the 50s. But up until, I remember the Communist Party in the 80s would be defending the Stalinist state very, very strongly, and anyone who criticized the Stalinist state was either labeled a Trotskyist or an anarchist. Now, for them, that state did not wither away. It is not just because of the personality of Stalin. It was because of the party machinery that Lenin himself put together, right? The type of party organization and the creation of this bureaucratic class to run the state. And once you create this bureaucratic class, this is the anarchist critique, right? Once you create this bureaucratic class to run the state, it's impossible to get rid of it as a natural process of unfolding of socialism. Because you're creating a class of people with an interest in the maintenance of that state apparatus. And they, of course, build their own class interests, bureaucratic class interests for themselves. Now, of course, when you read the State and Revolution, Lenin does talk a lot about democracy in the post withering away phase, I presume, self-government, etc. But and I know a lot of my Trotskyist comrades would say, you know, you're wrong to the liberal critique of anarchist critique is wrong to say that Lenin wasn't interested in democracy. And yes, it's all there, the invocation of democracy. But the big question that we have to face is, can you really have democracy without competition? Right? Without competition, can you really have it in a non-party state, one-party state, or a non-party state? That is the big challenge that we have to face. Now, Marxists, other libertarian Marxists or democratic Marxists also point out that it's not just anarchists and liberals that have made these critiques. Marxists like Rosa Luxemburg, Trotsky initially, but then he jumped ship and became part of the Bolshevik party machinery. But Rosa Luxemburg was a very interesting thinker, Marxist thinker. And she warned when Lenin came up with the idea of a Marxist-Leninist party, or we call it a Marxist-Leninist party, of the Communist Party, of the Bolshevik, or the party of professional revolutionaries. That became the basis of the future state apparatus once they achieved power. She warned that this notion of the dictatorship of the proletariat, what year was it? Was it 1905 that she warned? I can't remember, 1906. That the notion of the dictatorship of the proletariat would easily degenerate into the dictatorship of the party. And that then eventually becomes the dictatorship of the leader. Right? Now she warned about this before the Russian Revolution. Okay? And she was a Marxist. And that's exactly how it unfolded. Now we can have endless debates about whether, okay, if Trotsky had come into power instead of Stalin, whether things would have been different, because Lenin had died so early, etc., etc. I think there's a lot to the argument that the manner in which the party was constructed as a vanguard party, and which became the basis of the state, and the abolition of parliament, and the invocation of the Soviets as the true form of democracy, that therein lies the weakness, because you didn't have competition for power. That's something I think Michelle will elaborate on when you look at the Kerala experience, a concrete example of what we mean by that. Thinking inside. Maybe she's changed her mind. How much time do I have?
Another 10 minutes.
Okay, let me just quickly wrap up. I just thought now, so you had those initial conceptions and the Marxist-Leninist conception. Gramsci himself started off as an anarchist and became a Leninist, but he was a much more subtle thinker than Lenin, in my view. He had the opportunity to become more subtle because he was sitting in prison, he had nothing else to do. So you could just think and think through all these things. But Mussolini threw him in prison. And he, so the anarchist critique was about the base superstructure model, part of the critique, which is about, the economic base determines the superstructure, which is the nature of the state, etc. It's a one-way thing. Gramsci said, no, but actually Marx is much more subtle than that, and it was a much more dialectical process, a two-way, a reciprocal relationship, and the state itself can influence the economic base. And ideology can have a determining role as well. And his notion of hegemony is an important one in many ways. And it's very relevant to us today. But essentially, the manner in which ideology, manifesting itself in different forms, education, family, media, etc., religion, and how the state embeds itself and embeds the legitimacy of capitalism through these ideological mechanisms and obtains the consent of the dominated classes, of the working class. But always backed up by force. Right? So it's not purely ideological, force is critical to it. But however, what is very important in this conception of the state, and which also complicates the notion of the state or adds richness to the idea of the state being dominated by the capitalist class, is that it's always a state in, under capitalism, especially mature capitalism, especially the welfare state, is always a state made up of class alliances. There are always alliances between different class fractions. Fractions of the working class, right? And fractions of the capitalist class. They forge alliances to be the dominant power within the state. And those alliances always rest on compromises and real concessions. So the welfare state is not simply the capitalist class deciding to save capitalism. Of course, those are all dimensions to it. But it's also a reflection of the balance of class power, of class struggle in society, the manner in which the working class wins major concessions for itself, but only up to a point. And workers then have this dual consciousness. On the one hand, they have a vested interest in the state that they have called the welfare state. But on the other hand, they have a revolutionary consciousness because they know that they're still exploited as workers. So his expectation was that the working class party, he used military metaphors, but I won't go through all that. But the working class party would bring about a revolutionary consciousness in workers to overthrow the state. But in order to do that, you first had to engage in the ideological terrain. Now, after them, two other thinkers came after Gramsci, which were Wish mentioned, which is Ralph Miliband and Francis. They had a huge debate about the nature of the state under advanced capitalism, the welfare state. And that's important to keep in mind. This debate was about the capitalist state where welfare capitalism was fairly advanced. And Miliband was still arguing that the state was an instrument of the dominant class. But Miliband deliberately uses the word domination, not just exploitation, because his argument about the dominant class is that it's not just an economic relation, but it's also about patriarchy, it's also about racial oppression, etc. And the dominant class for Miliband comprised of both economic and political elites. So now here you have different arguments about the state as an instrument of the capitalist class. You have a simplistic argument that the capitalist class just tells the state what to do. For Miliband, he actually gives equal weight to economic and political elites who form what he calls the power elite. And here he borrows from other sociologists who are non-Marxist sociologists, like not Parsons, American guy who wrote about the industrial complex. Anyway, my brain's not And so that's the one thing. So he talks about a power elite, not just about the bourgeoisie. So advanced capitalism, which may or may not apply to us in South Africa, but certainly Britain, the United States of America, Western Europe. We have this power elite consisting of economic and political elites. And also, but this certainly applies to us, it applies to capitalism throughout the world, which wasn't the case in Marx's time. For Marx, ownership and control were fused in one. Right? Capitalists were the owners and they controlled the companies that they ran. Today, that's not always the case. In East Asia, it might be the case still quite strongly. I think Hyundai is owned by a family and they run the company. But in many global companies today, that's not the case. In fact, many big, large, global transnational companies are owned by the working class. You know that. The working class owns, but they don't control. Through your pension funds, you own these companies, but you don't control them. And Miliband writes about that ownership is no longer the key factor. It is a key factor, not the key factor. The key factor is control. So for him, the power elite, the economic elites are those who control the means of production, who control these big companies. But they themselves are not just evil people doing these bad things. You might say that Bill Gates and all these people. In fact, they're personally, apparently very nice people. But they are part of this treadmill of capital, of accumulation for the sake of accumulation. And for Marx, that is the defining feature of capitalism, of capital. Accumulation for the sake of accumulation. So you're on this treadmill. So you find that these CEOs, once you're elected as a CEO, you're on the treadmill, and all you have to do is organize the affairs of the company so that it brings about maximum returns for the investor, right? And those investors are not just individual capitalists, they're also your pension funds. And you, as a worker, have an interest in a high return on your pension fund because you want to have a high pension, right? So these are the interesting contradictions of capital. So we want these companies now to succeed at high return, but at the same time, as workers, we don't want to be exploited. So if we're caught in this contradiction within of the accumulation imperative, that's why it's important to focus on capital, not only on capitalists, individual capitalists, because they themselves are on this treadmill. Even if they're earning billions of dollars a year, some of them, forget the figures, and it's gone astronomical, right? If you follow football, you see the astronomical amounts of money Ronaldo earns. That's how CEOs earn. Just gone. It's part of globalization, as Fish mentioned. And you don't have those. If you don't have a global state to regulate all of this, it boggles the mind how much individual people can earn. So, and for Miliband, his main concern or focus was that if you look at the state, you can find empirical evidence of business elites in the state and the manner in which they influence state policy. And that's his research agenda. But Polanyi says, no, you don't have to do that. You don't have to empirically find out. In fact, it's not even in the interests of the capitalist class to be in the state. In advanced capitalism, it's in the interest of the capitalist class to actually be out of the state. Because the state will inevitably protect the interests of the capitalist class. And it's better for the state to have relative autonomy. Now, Polanyi, in his theorization, comes closer to the liberal pluralist perspective and the anarchist perspective, to giving autonomy of the state, but he still remains a Marxist, which says a relative autonomy in the final instance. The capitalist class indirectly influences the direction of the state. But the state has to be seen to represent the general interest and to mediate between these different fractions of capital and provide the cohesion and legitimacy. So, as I said, they're both writing, I will finish now, they're both writing about advanced capitalism, but we can see some of it resonates with us in South Africa. Interestingly, if you listen to the past the recent past. People like Jeremy Cronin, as the theorist of the Communist Party, people in the ANC, they would talk about the state as this autonomous entity, separate from the capitalist class, right? In fact, Jeremy Cronin at one point even talked about the state as a Bonaparte Estate. He was trying to argue that we're not really advancing the interests of the capitalist class, we're advancing all interests generally. All states say that, right? All states no state will say, no, we are a capitalist state, and we're advancing, well, okay, maybe if you're a worker state, you might say we're advancing the interests of the working class. But that's a very rare occasion. The extent to which they, as I said, pursue their welfare function is an outcome of those class struggles. Now you can decide whether the South African state, and we'll come back to that, is a capitalist state under the control of white monopoly capital, which is the allegation of the Zupta state captures, or it's substantially independent of all class interests, which is what the state itself says, don't they? But doesn't the state say that?
The state is
Now,
is very confusing.
Now what neoliberalism has done since the 1980s, it has torn the mask away substantially from the claims of the welfare state as being autonomous. Because capitalist interests have been much more nakedly on display. But now, in tearing away that mask, we are entering possibly into a post-neoliberal era. But what kind of era is that? Fish mentioned the return of state or authoritarianism from the right, but not just from the right, I would argue. Yes, Trump, the neo-fascist state, some people argue in India, there might be a debate as to whether neo-fascist is an appropriate word, but the party in power has got those authoritarian tendencies, strong authoritarian tendencies. But also I noticed amongst people who call themselves left, invoking through the BRICS argument, the BRICS as an alternative pole of attraction, looking to China and Russia. China is a one-party state. Russia is ostensibly multi-party state, but it's under the control of Putin. Looking to them as models, alternative models. So there is this temptation for those who are the critique of neoliberalism to look east in an uncritical fashion and say, well, that is what the path to follow. Whereas a democratic socialist alternative is one that embraces a lot of those early critiques of that I mentioned, and seeks to subordinate both the state and the market to society. By society, we mean the people. Maximum participatory democracy. What does that mean in practice? Is, of course, the real challenge for all of us. And can you have maximum participatory democracy outside the context of a multi-party state where there's competition for power? Well, those are big questions for us to deliberate on. Thank you.
So you have 25 minutes for comments and questions and additions. Which means that there's room for us to have particular variation. So yeah, Michael, we could have added in a reading on African patrimonial states and so on. Fine, we could have done that. But I think what was very important in these readings is that they mark out for us, if you like, the dominant tendencies in capitalism. Part of the problem with the neo-patrimonialism literature and so on is that it is really something that is exported from the Western Academy. and it kind of gazes into the global south in a particular kind of way. So even if it characterizes the state as a failed state or a neo-patrimonial state, etc., it is working on an assumption that there is a perfect standard that they're measuring those failures against. And that standard is the Western liberal state. And we can come back to that, but I want to just put that aside. Now, the context in which kind of new thinking on the state has been theorized, has been analyzed from a Marxist perspective is the following. So we've had over a century and a half of waves of marketization. There have been 3 waves of marketization. So if you look at somebody called Karl Polanyi's book, The Great Transformation, he talks about how marketization is anachronistic in 2,000 years of human history. And you see it in the late 19th century, which then leads to the collapse of the economic system and World War I. You see a repeat of that after World War I, and people not learning lessons and going back to the gold standard and going back to deep marketization and so on. And again, you see a collapse of the system and World War II. His argument is very different from Lenin, by the way. Lenin explains these conflicts in terms of global rivalries related to monopoly capitalism. But we are seeing a third wave of marketization over the past 3 decades. This is when Hayek and Milton Friedman and so on win. And that's the context in which we are seeing the expansion of capitalism on a global scale through marketization. US imperial power is in decline in this moment of history. It had a boost, a shot in the arm with financialization as part of this global marketization. But that was a shallow, if you like, rebooting of US imperialism. And it is in decline. But the US, over the past 3.5 decades, has used a form of indirect rule, particularly globalized financial markets and the state, to extend its influence. So there's been on a planetary scale for the past 3 decades a re-engineering of the global economy, including the interstate system. Now neoliberalisms, and I'm using this in the plural, because this is where you see particular expressions of neoliberalism. So in the African context, it gets hybridized, it gets translated, it gets articulated in an African idiom and so on, you know. So we talk about the African Renaissance, but it's an African Renaissance that's full throttle into neoliberalism and so on. In other parts of the world, there are particular articulations. So in Brazil, it's a kind of neo-developmentalism that embraces a kind of conservative neoliberal monetarism and so on. So at the same time, neoliberalism is a class and an imperial project promoting globalization. It's remaking the world order. It's remaking the world economy. It's remaking interstate systems. So Ellen Maskin-Wood is the first kind of Marxist theorist that we'll engage with very briefly. Ellen Maskin-Wood was a historian. She died in 2016, and she was also a theorist. And she was considered a political Marxist. And she was considered a political Marxist because she didn't accept this economic determinist or economistic Marxism that forces of production is what brings about social change. She attributed social change to the relations of production. And she theorized it. Neil Brenner is somebody else who's been placed in this camp of political Marxism. Now, Ellen Maskin-Wood recognizes that capitalism has certain common features at this level of abstraction. So, you know, you're not looking at particular capitalism, but you're looking at capitalism in general. It has competition, it has exploitation, it has accumulation. She also goes on to say that if we really want to understand the nature of the state today, we have to evoke the resources of historical materialism. We have to use historical materialism to understand the nature of a globalizing capitalism while at the same time you have a nationally bounded state. There's this global national contradiction. And if we use the kind of method of historicizing and history, if we understand the materiality of capitalism, we can make sense of this contradiction. She's also saying that the state is not a natural outcome of capitalism, and neither is it just a trans-historical phenomenon. So the state 500 years ago is not necessarily the same thing as the state today. So she's very rigorous in how she's trying to situate the state today. Now, she posits the theme of the state and capitalism.
Point of
Yes.
order, but
Yes.
can you put it on full screen, please?
Oh, sorry,
My
sorry.
side's not really.
No, fine, no. How's that?
No, that's beautiful.
No.
But
What happened? Oh,
Yeah.
okay, good.
thank you.
Is that okay? So, she looks at this question of relationship between the state and capitalism in her analysis. And she argues that we've got to be very careful with the history and how we think about the rise of capitalism and the nation state. And she basically looks at Western Europe, if you like, and how capitalism developed in the context of the early modern European state. And her perspective is nuanced here. She's saying that the state was not created by capitalism. Okay? This is very, very important. All right? However, in the context of the development of capitalism in England, the territorial nation state gets intertwined with capitalism. And there's various reasons for this, which I'll come back to just now. And so as an agrarian transition happens in England, as, if you like, competitive rural relations develop, the enclosures develop, the dispossession from the means of reproduction, etc. happens, you see the state developing together with capitalism in England. She also makes the point that if you look at the nature of the state pre-capitalism, you see a unity of economic and political power. So, the state under feudalism used extra economic measures to extract tribute, for example. But she's saying that under capitalism, that separation begins to happen between the economic and the political. And that's a historical specificity. She's also saying that in the development of capitalism, post-feudalism, there wasn't, if you like, one outcome. There wasn't a teleology working. There were many possibilities coming out of feudalism. Okay? And capitalism was one of many outcomes that emerges out of feudalism. And it really takes root in her analysis and her periodization of capitalism in England. Now, in England, what happens is, and unlike the rest of feudal Europe, where there are, if you like, fragmented sovereignties, in the UK and in England, with the development of an agrarian capitalism and so on, the fragmentation of economy and polity is overcome in England. It's not overcome in France. It's not overcome in Germany. It's overcome in England. And this fragmentation allows for the development of a capitalist state. Okay? The overcoming of these dynamics allows for capitalism to develop, conjoined to the development of a modern capitalist state in England. And so, what this does, it's underpinned by a division of labor in the way capitalism works, but again, it entrenches the separation of the economic in inverted commas and political in inverted commas. The moment of coercion and the moment of appropriation. And that's very, very important to keep in mind in her perspective. Because the separation of the economic and political is very specific to capitalism. And it has changed over the past 500 years. But it has remained nonetheless as a feature of capitalism. Now, she also situates the development of capitalism in relation to international relations. And she argues that as capitalism developed in England, it developed a vast internal economy, created a mass market, and it extracted surplus value. So in other words, the wealth of that society was the source of the wealth of that society was through surplus value creation. But she's saying in that process, the juggernaut of accumulation produces an expansionary tendency and imperialism emerges. So unlike Lenin, who sees imperialism as something that comes after 19th century competitive capitalism, she sees imperialism as, if you like, present in the making of the original modern capitalism in England. It is tied to colonialism and colonial expansion as well. But what she also says is that in the context of England, as capitalism develops and it requires and needs certain things, imperialism is also shaped by that. And as industrial capitalism takes off in the 1700s and 1800s, the industrial basis of capitalism also shapes the nature of imperialism, okay, and rivalries. So she's saying that capitalism in the European context grows out of the UK in its relationships with the world, with imperialism and colonialism and so on. But she's saying this also has an impact on the rest of Western Europe, okay, on the development of capitalist social relations. And in those contexts, the state plays a very, very important role. In France, the state plays an important role. In Germany, the state plays an important role, if you like, to develop capitalism. Okay? Slightly different from the formative moments of capitalism in England. At the same time, another crucial dimension in all of this is uneven development and the persistence of national forms of capitalism. So, she goes on from there to talk about nation states and classes in today's universal capitalism. Okay? So she's saying that capitalism has been universalized in this context of globalization. But underpinning it is class polarization. So there are class divides in societies, in capitalist societies, but there's also a logic of polarization between North and South. So as capitalism has spread and so on, it is still uneven. But she says that the nation state has not disappeared despite this universalization of capitalism. The nation state has not been subsumed, okay, by capitalism. And this is the crux and nuance of the argument for the purpose of our seminar. So even in Africa, over the past 3 decades of globalization, the nation state is still present. But the nation state is accompanying this universalization of capitalism. It is not becoming anachronistic. It is not vanishing. It is not disappearing. It's almost, if you like, intrinsic to this universalization of capitalism. So, global capitalism, in her thesis and in her argument, is organized through and on the basis of nation states, even today. Okay? It's presided over by nation states and the interstate system. It's a feature of this period of universalized capitalism. She's also saying that the internationalizing of capital does not mean the end of the nation state. So even as capital travels, so South African monopoly capital has traveled, it's gone offshore, it's went to the London Stock Exchange, Old Mutual went as far as the New York Stock Exchange. That didn't mean the end of the South African nation state. Okay. So she's also making the point that even with the emergence of transnational institutions, it doesn't mean the nation state has disappeared. Instead, she argues, with the rise of multilateral institutions, the WTO, etc., these institutions have reshaped the role and functions of the state, okay? But has not displaced the state, the nation state. Very important. So globalization and competition are basically organized in national spaces. They are organized within a context in which the nation state plays a pivotal role. Okay? So globalization and competition is not just something that happens at the level of the global. It is materially grounded in the national space, and the nation state plays a very crucial role in this period. She also argues that given the development of capitalism in this period, there's no global capitalist class, at least in the foreseeable future. But she's saying there are differences of interest. There are some capitalists or fractions of capital that do have interest in globalized value chains, in global capitalism and so on. On the other hand, there are other fractions of capital that still believe in a national capitalism and have to have their needs met in a nationally bounded way. So, while we have the conditions for a global capitalist class, she's saying it has not emerged yet. There are fractions of capital disposed in this direction, and there are fractions of capital disposed towards national accumulation. She goes on to build on this and to talk about a new imperialism in this period of universalized capitalism. And she's saying that the relations between capital and nation states take different forms. So the relation between capital and the US state is very different from the relationship between capital in Ghana and the nation state, for example, or the relationship between capital and the South African state. She's saying that we must keep these distinctions in mind. It takes different forms, okay? So capital is very strong and powerful in the United States, and it will shape the nation state in a particular way. In Ghana, I don't know, it might be stronger, it might be weaker, it might shape it in a particular way, and so on. She's also saying that imperial hegemony today is not just based on how big your army is and your capacity to wage modern warfare. She's also saying that economic imperatives have been used to advance and reproduce imperial hegemony. So structural adjustment programs. So in the African context, there are over 350 structural adjustment programs since the 1980, since the Berg Report, since the World Bank won out, okay? And in the moment in which Pan-Africanism was defeated. Now, over 350 structural adjustment programs have externalized the African economy, national economies, have adjusted national economies in the African context to global capitalism. So, she's also saying that these instruments have been used, if you like, so reshaping and remaking the state has been used to also reproduce imperial hegemony. So the expansion of capital has also, in this period of new imperialism, is also very dependent on the nation state. I mean, the interesting point is that at the level of abstraction that she's thinking, if you just allow capital to go with its tendencies, to go with its interests, she argues that it cannot organize even society. Okay? It will not work. You need the nation state to enable capital, to expand, to organize, to have conditions for accumulation, and so on. She's also saying there's a new kind of militarism, and this kind of militarism is about projection. It's about demonstrating to the rest of the world that if you don't march in tandem, we can unleash this awesome military force on you. And the US stands out in this regard. I mentioned that globalization is embedded, it's organized in local states that operationalize globalization. She says the closest we come in this interstate system, because there is this contradiction between a globalizing capitalism and a nationally bounded interstate system. The closest we come to a global state is the US state today. But it is not a global state. You must keep that in mind. But it plays the role of a global state. And I'm not going to go through the whole thing, and I'll end on this slide with Ellen Mason Woods, and I'm going to move a little quicker. So she asks the question, what form of state corresponds to global capitalism today? And she basically says that there are very powerful forces keeping the connection between the nation state and capitalism alive. In other words, there are forces that are not denuding this relationship. They are not undermining this relationship. They're powerful forces, including transnational corporations, including imperialism, including global institutions. They are using the nation state in a way to deepen and expand capitalism. But again, there's a separation of the economic and political that is working, okay, to reproduce the state and to reproduce capitalism. And we need to understand the specificity of that. It is reinforced by uneven development of capitalism. So you have national economies, and everyone is in the global competition race, etc. But this is still in the context of uneven distribution of capitalist relations. Markets are integrating more and more, and so there's a tension. There's a contradiction between the global and the national. And so, in a strange way, this tension between the global and the national is reinforced by the separation of the economic and political in the national space. So there's two distinct logics. The logic of coercion, the logic of accumulation. And these two things, these two logics, if you like, reinforce each other, but at the same time, they're at the heart of this global national contradiction. Okay? This brings to the fore a legitimation challenge. So while you have sort of the economy expanding and extending outward, and you have the state still playing its role, there are various challenges that emerge for legitimation in terms of democracy. Okay? And Ellen Mason Woods is one of those theorists that argue that capitalism actually is antithetical to democracy. And you see it in the context of this contradiction. The global state, she argues in the end, is a theoretical possibility, but it's undermined in the contemporary period of accumulation by capital's own logic. Okay? So capital, the crux of her argument, is that capital is not taking us towards a global state. That's the crux of her argument. Actually, capital is using the existing state. It's a dynamic process, not a functionalist argument. There's a dynamic tension in the logic of coercion and the logic of accumulation and so on. So that's Ellen Mason Woods. William I. Robinson belongs to what is called the global capitalism perspective on globalization. He has a very interesting theory of global capitalism. And he believes that globalization is a useful concept, particularly to understand a particular phase of capitalism, which I'll come to. Like Ellen Mason Woods, using historical materialism, he believes that the specificity of the state has to be appreciated. He also feels that in using a historical materialist approach, we must eschew dualities of national versus global, or the thesis of the end of the nation state. Because, by the way, some neoliberals have argued the end of the nation state thesis. And so that means the market must just do whatever it wants. Okay, the state must be evacuated completely. He explores three propositions. Economic globalization, and behind that, the creation of a transnational class, and at the same time, a transnational state, or TNS. He also looks to whether the nation state has been absorbed into a transnational state. So he's not arguing the end of the nation state, but he's arguing its articulation with what he perceives to be a transnational state. He also suggests that the transnational state institutionalizes new class relations between labor and capital worldwide. Now, to build on this, he periodizes capitalism into four epochs: mercantile and primitive accumulation, the 19th century competitive or classical capitalism, which Marx was observing and writing about, and corporate monopoly capitalism coming after that into the 70s. And then he talks about the fourth period of capitalism, globalization, and the rise of transnational capital. And he says we must keep in mind a distinction. Prior to this fourth period of capitalist expansion or globalization was a world economy. Today we need to be talking at the level of the global economy. And he's saying that as economic arrangements are becoming global, there's a lag in terms of political arrangements. And at the same time, he's saying that we are witnessing the internationalization of the state. And so his conceptualizing of the transnational state is interesting. He says the nation state as a category, as a geographic category, and it's a juridical unit. And he takes on Weber because he believes that this dualism of the global and the national has got to do with the static understanding that derives from Weber. And he says that in Weber you have the state standing outside of market relations, or the economy, and you have this market. And you have this dualism at work in Weber, which easily becomes the global national dualism in the context of globalized capitalism today. So there's the state that can do whatever it wants outside of the economy and so on. So he returns to a Marxist conception. The state is institutionalized class relations linked to social production and a set of institutions. So in a sense, there's an echo of Miliband in his perspective as well. So he says that the state is a distinct moment in a totality. Okay, so you have the economic moment and you have the state moment. The state is not necessarily tied to territory or nation states. Okay, so this is him opening up our thinking about the state. So the state is not necessarily, even in its historical development, bounded to a particular piece of territory. The transnational state is emerging from within the nation-state system. So this interstate system that we have that organizes about 190-something states, it's out of that the transnational state is emerging. He's saying that the transnational capitalist class is crucial. It's crucial because it's the material backdrop to this transnational state. It's emerging in the context of globalized production and finance, plus global institutions. Now this is a contrary point to Ellen Maskin Woods, for instance. Okay? And he's saying that the nation state, besides having to contend with the new transnational class, etc., itself is being remade in its relationship with supranational forums. And he traces some of this development and he locates it in the making of the structural power of transnational capital, which he believes has become more powerful than states. He's saying the global relative power of capital has also eclipsed the power of labor. And in a strange way, he goes back to the instrumentalist notion of the state. The state is a conveyor belt of capital. Its command center, if you like, is located in the global circuits of capitalism. So there's a clash between the logic of national accumulation and the global logic of accumulation in this context. So yes, the instrumentalist view of the state has an analytical purchase, a relevance, and a currency, etc. But it doesn't mean that flowing from this analysis that must be our politics, that we in turn must see the state as the instrument of our power and our rule. I think we must keep that alive in the conversation. So he further builds his argument with some empirical evidence where US supremacy from the 60s facilitates internationalizing of national capitals. The Bretton Woods institutions get eclipsed by offshore capital accounts and shadow markets. Global financial markets emerge over this period that he's looking at. You see the rise of the OECD, the World Economic Forum, the G7. And he says what happens is the UN and the Bretton Woods institutions get instrumentalized in this context of a transnationalizing state. And of course the WTO becomes very pivotal in the making of this transnational state. And he concludes by saying that there are crises within capitalism. Both the nation state, which hasn't disappeared, and the transnational state are ill-equipped to deal with these. So all the global foreign institutions we have are not able to manage these crises. So even the G20 has limits, etc. But he's saying in the moments of crises, there are opportunities for emancipatory projects. And central to his argument is that in the context of transnational capital, transnational state formation, we also need transnational struggles. So William I. Robinson is, if you like, a counterpoint to Ellen Meskin Woods in how we think about state formation today and its relationship to global capitalism. Now, to conclude with the last thinker very quickly. Stephen Gill is a neo-Gramscian theorist and thinker, and he's done a lot of work thinking about how we bring Gramsci into international relations. The forerunner to Stephen Gill was somebody called Robert Cox. But Stephen Gill also is thinking at a level of abstraction of how capitalism has expanded. So even how it's been located in the African context, in Latin America, the global south more generally, and so on. So he's thinking at that level of abstraction. So just keep that in mind. Okay? So he works with this hypothesis on, we are seeing the emergence of market civilization. In many ways, I think he's influenced by Polanyi. I spoke about that third wave of marketization in the late 20th century. And Gill is going further to say this is about the creation of a market civilization. Okay? And it has particular features, ideal type features in terms of the state, which I'll come to just now. He also talks about three principal elements of a new constitutionalism that has emerged to shape the state. Central to his perspective is taking law seriously. So most Marxists in the instrumentalist approach will say, well, the law is bourgeois law, that's it. It's an instrument of bourgeoisie. Stephen Gill is saying, no, we must think about law. And we must think about law in a very nuanced way. And it's not just something that's located in the superstructure. We must think about law as a governing technique that is constitutive of authority and power. We must also think about it as contributing to the power of capital and, if you like, the neoliberal forms of the state. So he has a much more dynamic view about law and its place in the making of the neoliberal state. So, the constitution of market civilization for Gill derives from somebody called Brodel, and Brodel used the category of civilization. It's a very big category. We don't usually use it in social theory, and we don't use it in social science, but it's a category that you can only apprehend in an interdisciplinary way, and it is a category that, if you like, is located in everyday mentalities, because it's a big category. We are part of the Asian, we are part of Chinese civilization, part of Indian civilization, part of Persian civilization, whatever, part of African civilization. And for him, Gramsci's common sense is one way to think about civilization. And he's arguing that there's a neoliberal common sense that underpins market civilization today. There's a geopolitical aspect, a political economy aspect, there's a place for law, and there's a place for culture. So there's a historical specificity to the making of market civilization, and it's got to be located in a long span of history, okay, to understand what's distinctive about it. In this case, he looks at the emergence of the state also in the English context, with dispossessions of monasteries, of peasantries, even of the monarchy, and so on. And so primitive accumulation, at least over the past 500 years, has been central also to the making of market civilization. So the new constitutionalism and the rule of law is a very, very important theme in his argument, and he says formal democracy is premised on property rights. So that's his starting point. And he's saying that the new constitutionalism we have is about limiting and depoliticizing and co-opting mass power. So over the past 3.5 decades, the kinds of neoliberal states that have been constructed, so even on our continent, even here in South Africa, has been about limiting mass power, depoliticizing mass power, and co-opting mass power. The economic is this private sphere, and it even has rights that make it sovereign, the right to enterprise and so on, the right to accumulate, etc. It trumps all other rights, labor standards, environmental rights, etc. And he's saying there's a concentration of capital that defines this power. So the power of capital, very similar to what Robinson is talking about, the structural power of capital, defines the power of capital today. So there's also a very interesting thought experiment in what he's presenting to us. He's saying, if you think through the absolute sovereignty of property rights, there's an absurdity to this. And the absurdity about property rights is that it can do whatever it wants with life forms, including with labor. Okay? And so he's saying that there's something wrong with this conception of rights. And this is what's being entrenched, this is what's being locked in. So the law is constitutive of social relations, and property is also about constituting legal relations. So there's a relational understanding of the law at work in his perspective. And ultimately he says democracy is defined as market democracy. So he has this interesting example of Russia and how the US political elite were thinking about the construction of market democracy and what kind of reforms were locked in to the making of post-Soviet Russia to make it a market democracy. How was the law used to lock in property relations, commodification, and so on? He talks about 3 dimensions of the new constitutionalism. Measures to reconfigure the state apparatus. So here he zooms in on things like judicial review, the way structural adjustment programs and good governance frameworks have been used to discipline states, how privatization has also been used to reconfigure the state, and he talks about what is confidence, I forget the 3 C's of capital. So essentially it's about creating a risk-free environment for capital. And the state apparatus has been remade to do this. The second set of measures that are part of this new constitutionalism is to construct and extend capitalist markets. And the law has been used to extend private property rights. So right now, nature is a site of accumulation, okay? Including the biosphere, carbon trading, right? We've made climate a commodity. Investment treaties, intellectual property rights of the WTO, which takes away our biogenetic resources. It gives it to powerful corporations like Monsanto, etc. So these measures have also become crucial for expanding capitalist markets. And the third set of measures that are relevant to this new constitutionalism is measures for dealing with dislocations and contradictions. And here he talks about 3 things. He talks about insulating economic policy. So we know that there's constant crisis with neoliberal accumulation. There's booms and busts, but it's also systemic. So financialized overaccumulation is here to stay as long as we have neoliberalism. There's already talk about the next blowout coming post the 10 years of the great financial crisis, because finance has not been reined in. But he says that the measure that has been locked in is to insulate economic policy. And economic policy is now beyond, if you like, you and me, okay, as ordinary citizens. He also talks about a Gramscian concept called transformismo, which is really about co-option, of resistance, of opposition, etc. And he talks about reducing economic policy to a technocratic discourse. So it completely disables the demos, the people. It's taken away from the demos, and it's the conversation of experts. Okay. So he's saying these three measures of reconfiguring the state apparatus, of expanding the capitalist market, and of dislocating contradictions so that the poor and the working class are constantly paying the cost, the price for the reproduction of this neoliberal system. And finally, he concludes with this idea that we still need resistance, and historically, if you look at the history of capitalism, from its mercantile origin, its proto-capitalism, there's always been a tension between the power of capital versus popular democratizing impulse. And he's saying that, and this is where he breaks with this instrumentalist idea, that we need to think about the plurality of social forces that need to be part of the struggle to change and democratize capitalism. And we need to think about non-vanguardist power from below. So again, this is an imagination that recognizes that capital is powerful. Capital has remade the state, that has reconstitutionalized the state, has locked in a whole set of measures. But the answer is not the classical Leninist answer, to just smash the state and place it under instrumentalist control of another subject of history. But rather, the answer is to deepen democracy. Okay? The answer is to pluralize social agency and aggregate new forms of constituted power from below. I think that's it. Okay. Questions, comments, additions, and there's other perspectives on the state, by the way. I just selected these three because I teach them to my students. So what are your thoughts?
And I decided to use today, when we think about the state, I decided to think about the developmental state, which is one of the primary forms that we often talk about. I want to give an apology as I start. It's weird to use today, but I'm not very good at technology. I'm usually old school. I don't usually use PowerPoint. And so I always write out my talks, but I also decided I'd try to do PowerPoint, so I'm going to try to manage both of these. And apologies in advance if it's not very smooth, or slides get behind or ahead. So it's an embarrassing truth. Okay, so first I want to ask the question, and maybe I'll throw it out to the audience. Do we still need developmental states? What do you think? So the first question is, do we even, I'm going to tell you what they are later, but I want to just start off by saying, do we need a developmental state?
I don't know what it is, so I can't vote.
But that's kind of what I wanted.
It's a loaded question. You're asking us if we want capitalism.
Right, you guys are just an impossible audience, right? I like my third-year students better. They just answer my questions. Yes?
I'm just going to take a shot at it and say yes. Considering the scale of our socio-economic challenges and ecological crises, I think a strong state will be required, although there must be room for democratic participation, sort of anarchist forms of democratic participation in the process, but I think a strong developmental state will be required.
Okay, excellent. So the argument is that whether it's desirable, then the next question is it possible? And what is it, right? I mean, that was Richard's point, is he refused to vote because he doesn't know what it is. Okay, so. Wants his information. Okay, so in the current times, I agree. I actually think that we need an active state in development more than we ever have. The state continues to play a crucial role in shaping economic development, and all the conversations earlier this morning were about the different understandings about whether the ways in which the state relates to capital, the ways in which the state kind of ushers in, challenges, promotes capitalism, as well as the economic and political elite. So I think that there's lots of arguments to show that the state has often, for at least in modern capitalism, has played an incredibly important role, and there's still a need for this role. But our conditions today have changed markedly from the past 200 years, and especially the past 50 years, in which the development state became an important political developmental tool. Okay, so let me start by making clear what is the developmental state. First of all, this was Fish's point. Fish's refusal to vote was different than Richard's, and his was because then we're making him vote for capitalism. The developmental state is an accumulationist state. It is all, in the historical understanding, it is concerned with accumulation. It wants national economic development. Historically, though, I think it's useful for us to distinguish between their features and forms of the developmental state. See, this is where I get confused. Okay, I'm going to use my notes rather than the slide. Sorry, this is what I was talking about. Okay, so just in terms of the accumulation of the state has always played an important role in attracting and directing investment, setting industrial policy, ensuring planning, and creating conditions for economic activity. And so you see this role in economic growth and in economic development, what we call development. So secondly, it is useful to distinguish between forms and features, what I call, and the effects or outcomes, goals of the state. The classic literature on the developmental state actually started with the outcomes. It saw all these outcomes of economic growth, especially in Southeast Asia, but also it looked at apartheid South Africa and the dictatorship in Brazil, and it worked itself backwards to identify what kind of forms were needed to create these economic outcomes. At this time, the Weberian bureaucracy, so the features were Weberian bureaucracy, state capacity, embedded autonomy, discipline, and political power. So these were the necessary features in which you could then have a developmental state. You needed these features as a fundamental requirement to be able to have developmentalism in this variant. The aims were almost by definition, reduced to economic development. And that then became the priority of the GDP, the gross domestic product, and this was now the big kind of focus of the 20th century developmental state. So the task of the state at this time was then to discipline capital, and this goes into the discussion we had about state capture, but I think we can come back to it. There's been really good work that talks about when capital doesn't get, when the state doesn't play the role of disciplining capital, it often gets captured by capital. So you'll see the difference between state contracts with capitalists versus state gifts to capitalists. And so this has been a really important part of understanding what the developmental state does. It extracts revenues through taxes. It provides a rule of law. It needs to create the conditions that there's rule of law so that it can attract investment. It creates appropriate policies, and it attracts investment, but not just international investment. The developmental state has also been very much about local, national investment. So you've had a triple alliance, not in the version that we know in South Africa, but a triple alliance between international capital, domestic capital, and the state. And this has been fundamental to the developmental state's success in the 20th century. And it protects industries and encourages exports. So these are all the things that the developmental state is generally seen to be responsible for. These are the definitions, the characteristics, and its activities. Okay, so for the 21st century, however, these things are not enough. And we've seen this in many, many places. So the 21st century developmental state needs to do many, if not all of the things of the 20th century, plus more. So it has this wider suite of goals. First of all, the economic terrain is much more complicated. It's infinitely more complicated, I'll go through this in more detail, but it's infinitely more complicated for the state to engage in economic activities when we're talking about finance, when we're talking about very expensive, capital-intensive technologies than it was around manufacturing, for instance. So it's a much more complicated economic terrain. There's many more demands for deepening democracy on developmental states. But in the very recent few years, that's been challenged, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. Our understanding of what development means has been expanded from economic growth to human development, and ecological sustainability is a fundamental issue for the 21st century. So I'm going to go through each one of these conditions in a little bit more detail, just to flesh out the specifics. So for condition one, economic restructuring, as it's a much more complicated economic terrain. The 20th century, we had, as I said, growth through industrialization and manufacturing. It assumed development in the national interests, and in economic language, this is often called autarky. Autarky is where you have some self-sufficiency, some national development, and but you're still somehow linked to a global system. These were the assumptions of the 20th century developmental state, that it was able to have national development in the national interest. And often when our state here today talks about this, I think it's assuming this still, that it can have some kind of nationalist development. The 21st century, however, requires not just growth in manufacturing, but to have real growth today, growth is occurring in services and knowledge-based economies and finance. If you look at almost all economies and where their growth indicators are, manufacturing is decreasing as a percentage of GDP, and these other areas are increasing. But it is infinitely harder to engage in a high-tech, knowledge-based economy than it was getting more washing machines into showrooms, for instance. So this is a much more complicated arena in which the state must act, and often states just don't have the capacity to manage this. There's a great example of the Taiwanese state. The Taiwanese state decided it was going to get into pharmaceuticals. This is a very capital-intensive, high knowledge-based economy. It pumped a ton of money. It did all the right things. In terms of developmental vision and ideas, it did all the right things. And yet, it ended up being a research and development wing of the large multinational corporations. It couldn't break into that level. And it just ended up kind of spinning its wheels. So you had all this public investment that was then being privatized by these multinational corporations. And I think that that's a perfect example on a state that's tried to engage in this knowledge-based economy, but the challenges with that. China's starting to do it now, and I think China has probably the financial capital and economies of scale. It might be able to do some of this, where it's trying to create and engage in the knowledge-based economy. Okay, but it also means that the state needs to be able to promote manufacturing and industrial development, but also enter the knowledge and innovation sector. So now you can see what the state must do to succeed, if we're talking about this nationalist developmental state, is much more complicated in the economic arena. It also must protect itself and its borders from the power of global finance and the power of transnational corporations. And we're seeing this increasingly. I went to a workshop recently about the failure of UN mechanisms to be able to control multinational corporations. And one of the examples, for instance, is there's no laws protecting us from Monsanto coming in and influencing our state to change, for instance, the seed laws that they've done recently. And there's no mechanism on a global scale to protect us against this, and our states are often not capable of managing this terrain. So you can see it's a much more complicated terrain. But I'm going to now show how there's also contradictions in what we expect the state to do. So secondly, the political conditions and demands on the state of today is much different. What I didn't mention, and I should have in my slide, is that the 20th century state, the accumulation of state was often based on authoritarianism. It was often based on very strong-arm types of state that discipline working class very, very strongly. But now we have a new geopolitical world with important changes for state power and efficacy. We've talked a lot about how states don't have the capacity to engage in the international global arena, or it's much more complicated, and Vish unpacked some of this in the previous session. But we also see increasing demands for democracy. I mean, I don't know your name, but that's exactly what you were saying. We need some of these, but we need it to be democratized. So there's demands for more democracy and more accountable states. But there's a contradiction there, because the ways in which, with the state delivery, we also see that states have state-client relations, that states often deliver to consumer citizens. So on the one hand, many of the welfarist functions of the state have produced state consumers and clients rather than active participatory citizens who can play this democratic role. We also see in the recent times, and I think this throws up a lot of questions for us, the rise of populism. Unlike Devin, I have no problems calling India fascist. We see the rise of fascism, we see the rise of authoritarianism. And I think these are all ways in which citizens are searching for different futures based on the failures that we experience today. So, but what this politics is about is it appeals to emotion and hate. Opinions are now facts. And I think this is about postmodernism entering the political realm, that we no longer postmodernism is all about relativity and about no facts existing, that everybody's opinions are equal, but this has now entered our political discourse. And the media as the fourth estate, I think that's changing. What it means when we say the media is the fourth estate is that the media has always been seen to play a very important role in democracies at informing the public, keeping us aware of what's going on. Good investigative journalism is seen to be an incredibly important check or a counter to state power. But what we're seeing now is challenges to this in interesting but also complicated ways. The role of social media both promotes and undermines democracy. And I don't think we understand how the actual implications. We've also seen how elections have been controlled by foreign powers in various places around the world through forms of social media. There's these things called bots, which I don't totally get, but apparently they can be fake people out there shaping opinions and things. So I think it's a much more complicated world. And this has profound implications for the politics and demands that we ask of the state. Now the third condition is the ideational changes. And what I mean by this is we've come to fundamentally different understandings of what is development. The 20th century really was uncontested. It was economic growth, and the idea was not just a fetishism with economic growth. That's certainly there in some disciplines, but it was also because it was assumed economic growth would lead to the increased well-being of all people. That was the idea, certainly in the mid-20th century, that the growth of the working class would raise levels of income, and that there would basically be increased well-being among societies. The empirical reality is that this has not happened anywhere. And in fact, we've seen increasing inequalities both within nations and across, and between and across nations. But the 21st century idea of development has many more criteria. It's not just about economic growth. In fact, for many development scholars, economic growth is meant to be in the service of human development, not the other way around. So you see that the ideas of development today are about human quality of life. Devin talked about the happiness indicator. There are states that are now saying, we don't want to just measure growth, we're actually going to start measuring things like happiness, well-being. How are our citizens actually doing? The Human Development Index was developed in the 80s and 90s as also an indicator for the well-being of society. So these are all ways in which we started challenging the priority of economic growth. There's also been a challenge, and I think this is one of the exciting challenges that comes out of the Global South, and this is to challenge what in the South African context we call decolonizing, but it's about challenging the Western-oriented understanding of modernity and the good life. What does it mean? Does it really mean that we have to have a particular type of modernity and a particular type of good life? And I think there's ideas now that economic growth needs to be embedded in society. So Amartya Sen, for instance, talks a lot about this. He's an economist who won the Nobel laureate precisely about human capabilities and trying to figure out ways in which human well-being is a fundamental part of economic development. But I think these ideational changes together with the previous two slides, shows a disjuncture. The states often work within the 20th century vision, and they see the welfare state as delivering rather than fundamental to development. So the state is still about economic growth, and then it delivers social development, social welfare in addition, but it hasn't actually seen that social development and human development are actually fundamental to its developmentalism. So I think there's a contradiction there that our states haven't actually come to terms with and continue to reinforce. So the fourth condition is ecological crisis. And I think this is the most important condition that our states face. We run the risk of basically creating the conditions that will no longer sustain life. And this is a fundamental difference from the 20th century. The 20th century developmental states destroyed the environment. They were able to basically do development without worrying about what are the environmental implications, both on the ecological but also the human populations in these areas and the global population in general. The 21st century developmental idea no longer has this, if you want to call it luxury. It no longer can get away with this. Climate change, energy politics, and the ecological impacts of development are patently clear. We are now facing the conditions that if we don't change things, we will no longer be able to survive on planet Earth. So there's very real ecological limits to capitalism, and I think this throws up really important questions that we must ask around, we've had a lot of techno fixes around green capitalism, about that you can actually fix capitalism by shifting from fossil fuel to a post-fossil fuel, but I think one of the fundamental issues of capitalism is the central role of growth. And if you accept that we have a planet that you can't have incessant growth on, then then it forces you to say, do we have to get to a post-capitalist world? And I think we do. Okay, before I go on to Carola, are there any questions about the developmental state? I didn't read my paper at all. I have I'm so bad at this. And yes, Zico.
Yeah. The way you juxtapose the 20th and the 21st century states, are you saying those ideas were within the leading organs of those states? Because you see, I'm posing this because the views about a developmental state, whether 21st or 20th, different as they may be, I think they came more from activists than the ruling classes of the country. For example, the issue about environment. You see the rise of green parties in Western Europe. That was something within, or rather, amongst activists in particular societies. Not that the states themselves had this notion. That's why they were put under pressure. We had green parties, we had environmental movements. Even now, climate change, 21st century, is embraced more by social movements, trade unions, activists in general, rather than the state per se. The states are forced to respond to these issues.
Thanks, I'm really glad you raised that. Yeah, I actually think on all of the four conditions I discussed and the challenges to the 20th century version, many of those are demands from society. Many of those are demands from activists and civil society. And in fact, most developmental states, South Africa is one of the few developmental states, as Fish said, it declared itself a developmental state before it actually was a developmental state, right? It was like, okay, we are going to become this thing. As I started off saying, many developmental states did this. So like you had Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, all these states that were doing these things. And it was only when scholars studied, hey, how did they suddenly get this high level of economic development, that they then went back and read onto them these features and forms. That's why I tried to make that distinction between features and forms. But then I'm saying that now in the 21st century, even what they did in the 20th century, And the problem is, our state is still trying to mimic that. And yet, that's not enough for the 21st century. And it's precisely because of these new demands and new expectations that are placed on the state. We're no longer accepting a state. I was at a thing yesterday all about ecological issues. We're no longer accepting the state to allow, for instance, mining just to come in and destroy the environment. So you're absolutely right. So the 21st century demands are demands largely coming from, I mean, except for the economic, some of the economic stuff, are largely demands that have come from below. The states, I don't know any state in the 21st century that's acting in the way that I'm saying, the 21st century developmental state. This is an ideal type, this is a vision, this is if you want a state that's going to have any chance of doing development that actually brings in human, ecological, these are the things that it would have to do. But certainly not our state, it's not doing these things. Yeah, so I agree completely with you. All right, is everyone else clear on the developmental state? Okay, so I just wanted to cover Kerala, because Kerala links to our conversation today a bit more about Marxism and the state. So as I said, the developmental state has really been about an accumulationist capitalist state. But we need state functioning, right? And so the question is, can you actually evolve this kind of state into something more radical? How many of you have heard of Kerala? Kerala. Okay, so Kerala is a state, is a province in southwestern India, and it became famous in the 1970s and 1980s. It's one of the poorest states in India. And it became famous because it advanced human development and got human development indicators that were equal to the first world. They had literacy rates in the 90+ percentile. They had human life expectancy equal to the US, for instance. They had infant mortality equivalent to many places in Europe, and also no difference between the girl child and the boy child. So all of these were seen as developmental successes, but it threw a big challenge to the development industry and the ideas about development, because we've always been taught that you have economic growth and that brings development. Kerala turned that on its head and said, no, we're going to start with human development, and out of that we'll get economic growth. So they became very famous for first throwing up, we can achieve human development, and they did, despite very low levels of economic growth. So it sees itself as kind of being a social developmental state, a democratized developmental state, one in which they've always prioritized human development. And, quite interestingly, also in relationship to activists, ecological issues already from the 70s were very fundamental to Kerala's development. The state in Kerala, how does it achieve these things? Well, there's a few things. One, the state is very embedded. When Devin talked about embedded autonomy. Embedded autonomy usually means capital has relations, or the state has relations with social actors. Most often, it's often capital, but it's also supposed to be with civil society, unions, other forces as well. In Kerala, the state is very embedded in subaltern classes. It is very linked to subaltern classes. It's a much more agrarian society, and I'm not suggesting Kerala is a model for us to mimic. I'm suggesting that there's some interesting lessons from which we can learn. So the state is embedded in subaltern classes, but part of the reason, or the way in which it's embedded, is what Richard's point earlier has to do with high contestation in the political sphere. And what does that mean? High contestation, they are a multi-party democracy in the terms of representative democracy. But what they've done is that there's two dominant political parties and then many smaller parties. So there's always coalition politics. And the two dominant parties, one's the Communist Party of India, Marxists, and the other one's the Congress Party. So kind of like the equivalent of the ANC and then a Communist Party. Neither one of these two dominant parties has ever won elections 2 times in a row. It fluctuates from the Congress to the Communists, and the Congress to the Communists. I mean, you can almost set your clock every 5 years by this alternation. What this has meant, and then each party has to do coalitions. But the Communists, because of its history and has learned, it only does coalitions with progressive left parties. The Congress does it with whoever's in their kind of orbit at that time. What this has meant is that for either party to win, they constantly have to go back to the base. They have to be in touch. people in Kerala, even Communist Party diehard members, I've heard them say, yeah, but you know, it reminds our party who put them there. You know, even if they're out of power, we've put them there. So high contestation has been crucial for a left politics to not only emerge, but to be sustained in Kerala. And some of the party leaders will tell you, I mean, maybe not publicly, but they definitely will say, when they're out of power, it also gives them a chance to kind of regroup and catch their breath again. Because being in power consistently is exhausting, but also you kind of you become rudderless. And this then forces them, when they're out of power, they're back to being organizers. They then are challenging, trying to get the policies and programs that they passed, they're trying to help get them implemented. So it's made it much more dynamic in terms of being linked and embedded in subaltern classes. So I want us to think about political power in this way, that we should not, I don't think we should ever blame political parties for wanting power. That's what they do, that's what they are. But it's up to us to make sure that we don't allow them to have too much power or become drunk with the power that they have. And I think Kerala is a good example. So this is one of the lessons to learn, is that the high contestation has actually helped empower subaltern classes in keeping parties on the accountable. In the 1990s, though, Kerala had this amazing development, but it wasn't able to sustain this without some kind of economic growth. So now it had to turn to the issue of economic growth. But again, the Communist Party was out of power and now was trying to figure out a way to make the citizens see that it's still innovating. And what it did was a democratic decentralization campaign. And what this was, it devolved. It's the most radical example of decentralization, I think, anywhere in the world. It devolved power and finances. 40% of the state's finances were devolved down to local level government and civic bodies. And this was meant to be basically for local development planning on the ground. And so, to actually do this, one of the things they learned is you can't just throw money down. Citizens, I talked about how citizens have become clients and consumers of politics and welfare goods. Here it's actually asking citizens to play their democratic role. But they realized this requires an enormous educational program. So they had training programs. I think it was over 4,000 pages of training documents, hundreds of thousands of hours of training from community activists, the parties themselves, because they said they're schooled in an old-style politics, so they had to retrain themselves, party leaders, state officials, bureaucrats, elected political leaders. Everyone went through various forms of training about how to do this democratic decentralization and about really enlisting and unleashing citizen control of planning. They also realized that planning is not something you can just leave to the winds, but it needed structure. And so they provided a lot of structure as well. They did things with, they put out an advertisement, for example, asking for all retired people who want to be part of technical course, people who have skills that could come and help volunteer and help communities develop their plans. So you'd have engineers, people in the community wants to build a bridge or a new road. They would have retired volunteer people come and help provide the engineering to make sure that the process was sound. They had transparency on tenders, who got the tender. It had to be publicly discussed. It had to be publicly acknowledged how much was paid, in what installments, what delivery. So it was very much about transparency as well. So this was the party's attempt to kind of, to convince the population to vote for it. It got in power, it runs with this, and it was quite extraordinary. And I think this was basically an example of democratizing democracy. It was already a democracy in terms of the representational, but too often we understand democracy as simply being voting in elections. And in democratic theory, that's actually the most narrow, shallow form of democracy we have, and it's shown itself to be captured. We often hear now people saying that democracy is not a good thing. Look at how it actually works in the interests of corporate elites. And that's because we've allowed democracy to be so narrow in this representational field that it's become a market democracy. It really has become capital interested democracies. In democratic theory, though, representational democracy, electoral democracy is only one small part of democracy. there's a much bigger part which is supposed to be participatory, democratic, decentralization. And it's these two that must work in conjunction. That the more empowered and participatory democratic structures, the more accountable elected structures are. And Carola actually does demonstrate this. So what this decentralization campaign showed was that it was reimagining, it was providing new state-civil society relations. It was now trying to say, instead of the state doing welfare and delivering to citizens, it was trying to co-produce through intentional design. When I say intentional design, I was saying it gave structure. It still said, of the 40% that was devolved, for instance, 40% of that had to go to local economic development. 10% went to women's issues. So they gave structure, so intentional design, but it was in democratic spaces of local government. The people within that broader structure were the ones able to decide and to define what was going to happen. It also unleashed new forms of agency. It turned clients, consumer citizens, into actual democratic citizens. And I think this new form of agency is really important. Carola has a long history of protest politics, a politics in which the citizens make demands on the state to deliver various things, various forms of protection. Here, it was actually moving beyond a protest politics to what I would call a generative politics, in which citizens are actually developing, they're generating a new economic, political dispensation, right? So it goes from just protest demands on to a generative. They had, there was a lot of empowerment of women and Dalits because in these spaces, I mean, they had to, I have lots of funny stories I can tell you about, but they had to put limits on politicos at public meetings. They were only allowed 2 minutes to speak, and especially men. And and what they realized is that women often don't speak and they don't feel empowered, so they would actually arrange a lot of neighborhood groups of women to meet weekly, and they would discuss amongst themselves what their issues are, and these groups then would go feeling like they already know what they're going to talk about when they would go to these public meetings, and that reinforced their voices, but they also became active in economic development through these local neighborhood groups. It also demonstrated democratic decision-making and local development planning. It was complicated, but they really were making sure people were part of that process. And it turned the local government into a co-deliverer of development goals. So people were deciding what their goals were, but they were also co-delivering those goals. And I really want to make this clear that in democratic theory, participation is meant, there's 3 types of participation. First participation, pseudo-participation, is where you go to a meeting and you're basically informed. We get this all the time, there's consultation. We're informed what's going on, right? But you're not part of the actual decision-making, you're just being told what's going on. Then there's a partial participation, and this is where you go to a meeting, you have a discussion, and then the leaders go back and say, okay, it's noted, we'll come back to you, right? But they note your input, but they have the power to make decisions. Here, it was about qualitatively real participation, where you have people coming together and making the decisions, and then making sure those decisions get implemented. And that whole line was crucial for there to be a genuine, decentralized, democratic process. Okay, but it also has taught us many challenges and lessons. And one was the first 5 years when they had it as a campaign and they put thousands and thousands and thousands of activists into this, they were able to keep the dynamism. Then they institutionalized it because that was the idea. But once it became institutionalized, it became bureaucratized and routinized. And the question is, and they're still struggling, how do you prevent it from becoming bureaucratized and routinized? So all the rules and regulations to ensure participatory planning, how do you then, those don't become, that they basically are disciplining democracy rather than democracy disciplining bureaucracy. And this is one of the big questions we struggle with in sociology from Weber up to now, the relationship between bureaucracy and democracy. They haven't cracked that nut in Canada. It actually still is throwing itself up. Secondly, the issues of scalar limits, meaning the different scales. Fish raised this in relationship to Ellen Meskin Woods, the contradiction between global capitalism with nationally bound states. But in Canada, it also shows the contradiction happened between the provincial, local, and the national development. And that's because at the national level, the nation state, the national Indian state has adopted very macroeconomic policies, neoliberal macroeconomic policies, in which it was structurally transforming its economy. So Kerala went from an agrarian economy where, 30 years ago it had 60% of its state domestic product was from agriculture to 8%. And what it was replaced by was the service sector. But the service sector had two streams. There's the high-tech service sector, and then there was the low-tech. So a lot of the agricultural folks Kerala did land reform, or sorry, this is an aside, but they did an interesting land reform that I think is instructive for us. They had two dimensions. They said, on the one hand, we realize people need a house site. People need a piece of land that gives them security in this world. So they did land reform that gave people relatively small pieces of land as house sites so they could have a home. And then there was also land reform that was about agrarian transformation. So you have, whether you had capitalist agriculture or collective agriculture, but you also had an agricultural development as well. So they had this interesting two-prong. But here you have now the agricultural workers ending up in the low-tech sector, which was mostly about tourism, hotels, restaurants, and the high-tech, which was IT. So you had an increase in inequality. So Kerala comes from a very low income inequality and wealth inequality, and this has grown in the recent years with the structural transformations of the economy. And so the Kerala example shows the limits, even though they did all this exciting stuff at the local level, and they did have growth, and they had even growth in terms of cooperative development, economic growth at the local level, they still found these challenges from the macroeconomic sphere set by the national state. So I think a variation on Bish's point of Ellen Miskin-Woods is not just between national states and the global, but all the way down to the local, because the local is crucial for us, because that's where felt needs are. Needs are felt, but also needs are met. But it's also the space that actually gets trumped by these other levels. So I think we have to actually think seriously about that. And then I think it also raises challenges around this idea of autarky. And so I wanted to play with this idea of embedded autonomy, not within national, but actually embedded autonomy with and from the global order. So I think we need to really rethink the relationships between the global and the national, provincial, and the local. Okay, that's it. Thanks.
You guys organized yourselves?
I don't know, we didn't, we just said I was going to go first, so should we take questions now, or should you go?
I don't care. Yes.
I think it's busy.
He comes now?
Yeah,
Okay.
it goes together.
Okay, so, David, are you doing PowerPoint?
No,
Oh, I should have just done what you did. I got intimidated by them.
I didn't. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I think my input, which is derived from the paper or article that has been circulated as one of the readings, it's about whether the post-apartheid South African automotive industrial policy fit into the category of a developmental state. Can we use that to say there is some kind of construction of a developmental state? As Michelle was saying, that the state has positioned itself as aspirant developmental state. So I use the automotive industry to try to answer that question. But for me, it raises other broader questions. This the automotive industry, and the policy, it raises a broader question about the class character of the post-apartheid state. And of course, the second question to that is the type of capitalist state that we basically have. Is it developmental, neoliberal, nanny? So that's the broader question that it basically attempts to answer. And I think in the morning we discuss issues about what makes a capitalist state. And generally amongst the left in South Africa, There are people who argue, like the SSCP, that the state is not capitalist because it's contested. So we don't have a capitalist state because the state, it is contested. You can't say it's capitalist because it is contested. And that's Jeremy Cronin's line, and I always say that the fact that in a factory, the workers and the bosses are contesting, does it make the factory a non-capitalist factory? The contest in itself does not necessarily make the state to be class neutral or the factory to be class neutral. There's always a contest in a capitalist society, but Comrade Jeremy and I, we hold a different view on this particular issue. There's another point that says it's not a capitalist state because we've got communists, we've got the left in the state, therefore you can't say the state is capitalist. Are you saying General Secretary of the Party is the capitalist? No, it can't be. You've got communists, you've got the left there. Therefore, this can't be. The presence of the individuals in the state, it can't be a capitalist state. And it builds again on this notion that it is a contested thing, which we can't define as class character. So that's the first wrong view. I think, for me, the state is capitalist, not because there is a left in it, but because the state itself, like a worker, depends on capital in order to reproduce itself. For the state to generate its own revenue, it needs investors to invest. If they don't invest, they won't have the tax base to basically generate that revenue. For them to create employment, they need capitalists to basically invest in order to employ people. So the state is structurally tied to the power of the capitalist. So the capitalists, they don't need a Gupta-linked person in the state for the state to be capitalist. They can use investment, power, their ownership and control of the means of production or investment decisions to basically say, look, this is what we require from the point of view of the policy, and the state has to create investor confidence in order for the investors to basically come in to do certain things, and therefore the state is capitalist in that sense. You know, the DTI minister is going to please capital. If it doesn't, then there will be no investment and it will be trouble. So the state is capitalist in that sense, in the sense that it has to basically prioritize the needs of capital as long as it's operating in the capitalist economy. So every state leadership or elite or managers, they face this dilemma on how to basically achieve developmental outcome in the context where the means of production or the economic resources are in private hands. How do you get those resources to produce or to be steered towards developmental outcome? Okay, you can either take the means of production from them and then you socialize them, you have socialism. If you can't do that, you've got to discipline capital, meaning that you've got to make sure that you can leave the means of production in their own hands and therefore say, these are the developmental outcomes that we basically want. So essentially, the whole notion about the developmental state is the capacity of the state to discipline capital to produce certain outcomes. So a developmental state is a capitalist state in this context. So the state has to discipline capital, and I think Michelle spoke about, and even earlier on, we talk about the possible, and this is a notion now about the relative autonomy of the state. And underline is relative autonomy, it's not absolute autonomy. So if you are tied to some tree and the rope is too small, you can't move too far. Your ability, your freedom to move throughout a particular distance is determined by the rope, the size of the rope. But if the rope is too long and very elastic, your freedom to move from that tree, it's much more, you've got a relative autonomy. Your degree of freedom is better than that smaller rope. So the relative autonomy is not absolute autonomy. You're still tied to this tree, and this tree is basically capital. So what then determines the relative autonomy of the state under capitalism? I think Michelle said some of the things there. The strength of labor, the extent to which labor is strong, or the working class is strong, to basically make certain demand. The welfare state, I think Devin was speaking about it. It came about not because the bourgeoisie wanted to. They felt bad for the working class and said, no, let's give them some crumbs, let's have free education. It came as a result of the class struggle from the below. The New Deal as well. We can go on and on historically to show that concessions from the capitalist class, they come about because of the power of the working class and democracy itself. It was not given. The right to vote, it came about as a result of the working class struggle, demanding to democratize society and order. So the relative autonomy, even of the state under capitalism, comes about as a result of the level of organization and mobilization of the working class itself. So the stronger the working class is organized and mobilized, it sets the necessary conditions for demanding certain developmental outcomes or imposing certain developmental outcomes on the state. But there's other conditions that makes developmental state possible. I think if the capital itself is interested in the developmental state, in the creation of a developmental state, an example of South Korea and India is basically that example in which, because South Korea, the capitalist class was interested in the developmental state, India, the bourgeoisie, was not interested in that. So they fought very hard against the disciplinary state apparatus which required them to do planning and so forth and so forth. But they were more interested in subsidy, because the other key features of developmental state is the ability of the state to discipline and subsidize. And why you are able to discipline capital is the capacity of the state. And I think Michelle spoke about those issues, the Weberian features of the state, competent bureaucracy, ethical bureaucracy, because if you don't have that bureaucracy, or that bureaucracy which gives you some relative autonomy from capital, you're more likely to be easily captured by the cultures or by whichever capital. Because if one section of capital captures you, you are not in a better position as the state, even to, if you like, discipline them towards a particular direction. They will tell you what to do at the expense of other sections of fractions of capital. So the leadership of the state, the Weberian bureaucracy, and the determined political leadership, it does give some kind of relative autonomy insofar as the state set the necessary condition for the developmental state. So let me quickly come to the issue about the automotive industry, on whether what we've done since I used the MIDP, the Motor Industry Development Policy, which is now called the APDP, Automotive Development Program. So it was installed in 1995 by the democratic government. And I think it's important here to understand the structure of the automotive industry, because it's an international, integrated global industry. So when in Germany, Mercedes-Benz or VW, they sit and look around the world, they ask themselves certain questions. If we were to manufacture this model, where should we manufacture it? And their answer, the key 5 factors that they look at, is basically the size of the market. If the size of the market is big, they are more likely to set up a plant there and expand it, because this economics of scale. That's why China, the investment has basically grown, because the market is quite big. They also say, okay, if we were to set up a plant in South Africa to have components, because it's not everything that is in your car which is manufactured in a country. So they said, they will need the components firstly, whether that country has the capability to manufacture certain components. If yes, it's a tick. The third thing, they say, okay, logistics, because it's not every component that we manufacture in that country. We need components from all over the world. So is it possible to take in components into that country? And once you've manufactured the vehicle, logistically, is it easier for you to basically export it? Because you're not going to manufacture one model in one country. You've got to manufacture different models in different countries in order to realize the economics of scale. I mean, C-class, you say, okay, we're going to manufacture it in South Africa, but still export it to, to the United States. This model, we will manufacture it in Latin America, for instance, and it is going to be exported to meet the interests of the elite in South Africa. Will export it there. This luxurious Mercedes-Benz, because not all luxurious Mercedes-Benz that we have are manufactured here. So there's different models, and can you imagine if you're to produce those models with that segmented market, you're not going to realize the economies of scale. So they said, okay, logistically, is it possible for us to basically get components in and get the final product to different parts of the world? So they look at the infrastructure, very serious. The skills, it's an important consideration. And for the third world, the subsidy, how much as government you're subsidizing them, is an important consideration to determine whether they are taking this model to Mexico or to Thailand. And if you are giving them less incentives, or they can even force you as government to basically increase your incentives. So there's now the issue about the subsidy. Remember, the developmental state is a question of subsidy as well as the discipline. Now, in our case, South Africa, we have, in terms of the market size, we're very small, less than 1% of the global market share. So we are not very significant insofar as the automotive industry is concerned. China is still leading. Components, yes, we do have capabilities insofar as components are concerned, but only 35% of what's in your car is manufactured here. The rest is imported from from different parts of the world. Infrastructure, okay, they complain about different deficiencies insofar as the infrastructure is concerned. So my research shows that they are very concerned about our logistical capabilities, but we are far much better in terms of our infrastructure, Transnet and other infrastructural programs that we have as a government. We are relatively better, but they are worried about the aging infrastructure and all that. Skills, well, capital will also create skills. When they realize there's no skills here, they will make sure that they put money for the production of skills. I mean, BMW, we produce the world-class cars, and the workers there, almost every year, they've got this competition of the best quality of the car that has been produced with less defects. BMW always, in Roslyn, they always talk, they are world-class. The workers there, they're quite skilled and all this kind of stuff. So the whole thing about skills, the workers there in BMW, they're quite skilled in many respects. Subsidy, in terms of subsidy, so 23 billion subsidy to the automotive industry. That's the current figure. So if you see this free education and all that, and that's where the issue about the nanny state. So I'd say we've built, basically, we didn't build a developmental state, we've built a nanny state because the whole idea that we don't want to build a welfare state, a nanny state, subsidizing the poor. We're actually subsidizing capital in a significant way. So in my argument, I'm simply saying that we've basically built a nanny state for capital as opposed to a developmental state. What could have been the alternative if we say we're using the automotive industry as a case study to build a developmental state? Okay, we would say, let's say for argument's sake, we say, okay, that 23 billion should be used to subsidize the automotive industry. what are the things that we should be imposing on them for them to get this 23 billion? We can debate on whether for me it's a lot of money, but let's say we agree we can afford that 23 billion. I think if we were to build a developmental state, for instance, in the context of the climate change and the environmental challenges that we're facing, we will say, no, we'll subsidize you if you're going to produce an electric vehicle, for instance. So you move from this crisis that we're basically facing now of the environment, because they contribute significantly to our environmental degradation. So you could say, BMW, everyone. South Africa, we're driving electric vehicles. Therefore, anyone who needs subsidy must manufacture electric vehicles. As an example, you could even say we have a big challenge insofar as public transport is concerned, and therefore we'll subsidize people who are manufacturing buses to deal with the crisis that we basically have. This, for me, in which we spend so much money on these multinational companies, it's another form of state capture, which is not very developmental. We're basically babysitting this automotive industry as a nanny state. Thank you.
Thank you.